So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. Please be seated. A few years ago, back when I was still in North Carolina, I was a part of a centering prayer group of mostly other clergy in our diocese. And we got together once every 3 months at a place called St. Francis Prayer Center, and would just spend the whole day in centering prayer together. The person who organized this, his name is Stephen. Stephen had done a lot more contemplation than I had, and he told a story about one of his, a number of times where he had gone to do a whole week of centering prayer. Let me tell you, that's a lot of quiet. I've done no more than a day. A day is a wonderful thing to do. I'd love to do that at some point. But he talked about an experience that he had had after a week of quiet, only contemplation. The experience was when the week finished, he got in the car to go home. He drove for a while, and suddenly, he got lost in his own world. And fortunately, all he had done was ended up at a stoplight and completely forgotten how you're supposed to drive and observe stoplights. And so it was the little honk going toot toot, and he woke up and said, as he told the story, he was so lost in the still point that it continued with him as he continued to drive. And thank goodness that was the only thing that happened. He was able to drive and get home safely. But I think of that story of being so lost in contemplation that you forget the ways of the world. I hear a bit of that story in Jesus walking on the water because of the way that we build the story up to that. Jesus goes to the mountain to be alone. Now, this is after the feeding of the multitudes, after church service on the lawn, where he hands out bread and fish to all who need it. He needs some time alone, and so he sends the disciples off, and he goes up to the mountain to be by himself. And we don't know what he does. We don't know if it's a restful night or a restless night. We only know, actually, that he was by himself. And we can already take from there that there is a value in being alone. There is a value in being alone with God. And that learning to do that is part of our spiritual growth. Jesus goes to spend the night on the mountain by himself, but things are not quite so peaceful for the disciples. And the boat that they are in, which has begun to drift out away from the shore, suddenly is rocked by waves, and it becomes frightening and dangerous. And Jesus, to me, it's the way that the gospeler doesn't, the evangelist doesn't make a big deal. He doesn't go out to the side of to the ocean, the water's edge, and say, you know what? I'm going to walk out onto the water and show them what I can do. Check it out, Peter. No, it's almost as if, like my friend who forgets how to drive a car, it's almost as if after this time alone with God in deep contemplation, Jesus forgets that he's not supposed to walk on the water. And so he just heads out there to the friends that he loves. He simply goes out onto the journey. He was so onto the ocean. He had become, in that time of contemplation, disconnected from the world that we think we see, and so connected to the eternal that he forgot what he was and wasn't supposed to do, and simply journeyed out onto the water. Peter sees this. Now, when you think of this story, do you think of Peter my first thought is of Peter splashing into the water. And we all kind of say, oh, Peter, you had it, and then you lost it. Too bad. But think about the miraculous nature of what Peter does in this moment. Yes, Peter doesn't quite pull the trick off. Yes, Peter starts to walk to Jesus and then just collapses in a great big splash and relies on Jesus to pull him out. And we might say, oh gosh, Peter, there you are again. And yet, he made it like 2 or 3 steps. Can we talk about that? I mean, how many of us have pulled that trick off? It's pretty remarkable. The disciples must have been in the boat just slack-jawed like, oh, you can't see that. Wait, and we're like, oh, right? What are we looking at? We could instead see this as a moment of incredible courage and trust that Peter showed in a moment when the storm was raging. Peter stepped out, and in those 2 or 3 steps did something incredible. Yes, stepping out of the boat is a part of the spiritual journey, and it will involve face plants and splashdowns. And perhaps if we're not splashing into the water every once in a while, then we might want to journey a little farther out of our own comfort zones. Peter, in the chaos of the moment, and in whatever he was feeling in that moment when he saw Jesus walking towards them, Peter seemed to forget that he wasn't supposed to walk on water either. And so he stepped out and he walked, just as Jesus did. And it's as if it was the wind that came up and rustled past him that suddenly reminded him, wait, whoa, I'm not supposed to be doing this. And then splash, and it was over. That reminder was all it took. And Jesus then says, and think about how you hear this phrase, you of little faith. Jesus says to him, you of little faith. Now, we have at some point all heard this as a kind of admonishment. But does that make sense when we think about the incredible courage and risk that Jesus showed in that moment to admonish the one person who actually stepped out of that boat and was able to take a few steps towards Jesus? Perhaps we don't need to hear this as an admonishment, oh, you of little faith, but rather we can hear Jesus speaking almost as a guide, speaking to a pupil or a student, someone still in their spiritual adolescence. So not negative at all, but just naming what this is. Almost like a parent of a child who is taking swimming lessons, who is proud of them. Look at you, you of little faith, you little one. I'm so proud of you for what you did. Now let's pull you up and put you back in the boat and try again soon. How did he do it? How did Peter take those few steps? Perhaps it has something to do with vulnerability. The storm had shaken him loose from what he thought was the way that the world worked. His vulnerability, his willing to risk something, is where he met Jesus. The walk on the water was where Peter, in his vulnerability, met Christ's oneness with the created world. Suddenly, Jesus steps into the boat and the wind ceases, leaving us to think a little bit about what exactly faith is. When we think about sitting in this boat in the midst of the storm, whatever that storm may be, and we know there are many, we may be tempted to think that faith is just some blind thing, that it means living without fear or pain, or that it's a belief that God will step in and make things better in one providential moment. But as I see Peter's willingness to trust Jesus enough to walk to him, as well as the risk that Peter was willing to take in that moment. I wonder if faith isn't the capacity to hold vulnerability and trust in a kind of holy tension with one another, an invisible tension as hidden from us as the water's capacity to hold a boat at the surface, but just as real. A balance that can be as dramatic as stepping out on the water, or as simple as letting Jesus climb into the boat with us. You of little faith, why do you doubt? Or perhaps, you of little faith, look at what your faith has brought you. Look at those steps on the water that you have taken. Yes, we will doubt. Yes, we will hear the wind and we will forget that the living water can hold us. But know that these splashes into the depth are signs not of faithlessness but of courage. They are every bit a part of the journey as the quieting of storms. And each time we fall beneath the surface, each time the winds pick up and the storms shake us to our core, Christ will lift us up from the water, step into the boat with us, and journey with us to a place of peace.